There are four components to my talk today. I will first speak of walls of the mind. For those of you familiar with Peter Schneider, the wall in the head. I like walls of the mind better, it sounds more poetic. And then I'll be talking about the genealogy of the Iron Curtain outside of Berlin, and focusing on two distinct points in time that I think illustrate how minds built the border. One is in the 1940s, when the border was still an invisible line, and one is in the 80s, where it was a solid Iron Curtain, people believe. So this is the quote that to me sums up a lot of the practice of history. For those of you who know Peter Schneider's The Wall Jumper, I think it's one of my favorite books of all time. And the quote is, "Where does a state end and a self begin?" And it's really about how our minds are enmeshed in the society and political reality in which we live. And so I'll be talking about the Iron Curtain, but I really think this is a fable, a moral fable that can apply to all sorts of situations. And it's about how the parameters of our thoughts have shaped the parameters of our actions. Now, shameless self-promotion. This is my book coming out in May, and it's about Hans Asperger as an Asperger syndrome. And Asperger has a reputation for being a great guy. He created our conception of the autism spectrum, but he worked in Nazi Vienna, and he was really enmeshed in the world of Nazi psychiatry, which was trying to cultivate social spirit to make good fascist subjects. And there were all sorts of people in his world that were creating diagnoses of children who lacked social spirit. The other component is that he was involved in the murder of children considered to be disabled. This is unknown. So I'm happy to answer questions about this too. And really my point here is this is kind of the same thing as the Iron Curtain. It's about how the thoughts and reality of one time can create something that is long-lasting. We're still using his diagnosis 70 years later, almost verbatim. So this is a more cheerful topic today on the Iron Curtain. You are probably familiar with images such as this of the Berlin Wall. Here it is going up overnight on August 13th, 1961, and here it is growing into a monstrosity. This is the graffiti on the western side of the wall. And my story takes a rather unconventional look at this creation of a deadly wall. This book is the first social history of the Iron Curtain that spans the Cold War. Usually these histories are told in military terms. And it focuses not on the role of governments and militaries, but on the contribution of people who lived along the fences. And the question is how people living in a cohesive community, right, the Thousand-Year Reich, within 1 year began to see people on the opposite sides of the border, of an arbitrary border, as fundamentally other. I'll argue that people became East and West Germans within the late 1940s. And so although Germany had been united, at the end of World War II, the Allies imposed this temporary line, and you quickly begin to see the creation of difference where there is no difference, the institutionalization of violence among neighbors. These are not Jews, these are not Poles, these are neighbors that people are institutionalizing violence against, and popular participation in a system that was deeply unpopular. The wall was not popular, and yet people participated and guarded it. And so people gradually normalized the monstrosity in their midst. So my central claim is that the lethal barrier between East and West Germany was not simply imposed by communism, but that it emerged haphazardly. And it was made by both East and West, as well as by the accumulation of actions by ordinary people. And so in many ways, this photograph encapsulates my argument. It's taken in the late 1940s when the border was still an invisible line. This is a checkpoint, so you see the gate, but otherwise the border is invisible. And you see a mother and son who are trying to reunite, and a Western guard standing between them. And whether or not these two, the mother and son, can talk is really under his discretion. At this point, there's no rule governing. There's, the system of passes is still quite fluid. And this is an infinitesimal interaction, right? It's a micro step, but here's a step toward adaptation, right? If he says, no, you can't cross, that guy's going to go back and tell people I can't cross the border, and the mother will say the same thing, and the guard will report that back to headquarters. And so I really look at how this accumulation of everyday actions can create a border. And I'll go into more detail. And so throughout this talk, I'll be really emphasizing the importance of social fabric. This is social fabric getting eroded right here. And how the strength of Germany's wall came as much from the society that supported its creation as much as concrete. And so today, as borders proliferate around the world today, right, Trump talks about building a wall. It's clearly not going to be a wall in concrete anytime soon, but it is a wall in the head. You have people chanting, build the wall. And so what is that? That's a perceptual wall. For millions of Americans, there's already a perceptual wall between the US and Mexico, even though there won't necessarily be an actual wall. So as we talk about the border between the US and Mexico and the Israeli security fence, Germany's story really warns us how the idea of a wall can permeate the culture. And I think we're seeing that today with, enduring consequences. And micro steps have far-reaching results. And I would say that, at the other side of our metaphorical wall, as people chant it, Mexicans became more other than they previously were. Those people. Not to get too political. But, so here we go to the genealogy. Okay, so compared to international relations today, the Cold War in retrospect can appear a simpler, steadier time. The Cold War's most central symbol, this moral symbol of Western democracy and righteousness fighting against a totalitarian system, a portrayal of stark East-West conflict. And in popular imagination as well as scholarship, the Iron Curtain, really more than anything else, seems monolithic, imposed by communism, imprisoning East Germans from escaping to the West. And for the West, the Berlin Wall underpinned this moral consensus from Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner speech to Ronald Reagan's Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. These are iconic moments in the Cold War. And the Berlin Wall has even transcended the Cold War. If you remember the celebrations in 2009 about the fall of the wall, that it was invoked as a universal symbol of oppression. So today I'm presenting a very different story, revealing the human underpinnings of this barrier. So yes, the Berlin Wall did go up overnight in 1961, and everyone knows that. It went up overnight. But what happened in Berlin was the last step of building the Iron Curtain. It's the, really the tip of the iceberg. And so what I look at is the creation of the Berlin Wall since 1945, since the moment hostilities ended in Germany. And so by the time the Berlin Wall went up, there was already a deadly barrier between the two Germanys that had been growing for 16 years. Germans were already used to this deadly barrier between them. So after World War II, the Allies established different military governments in Germany. There was a Soviet zone in the Western zones, which later united to become West Germany. And quickly, there was this invisible demarcation line that quickly became problematic. And Berlin lay inside the Soviet zone, but it was jointly administered by all four powers. And the line there remained open until 1961. So here we have a deadly barrier developing that's 1,400 kilometers. This is the distance from Chicago to New Orleans. So imagine Chicago to New Orleans cutting the U.S. in half. It's a monumental task to guard this border. But this Iron Curtain has received nowhere the attention of the Berlin Wall. So when I first began this project, it was certainly eye-opening to see just how dynamic this border was. It kept changing. And the archives revealed how local officials participated in its construction. So here's a brigade of East Germans clearing logs to construct the fortifications in 1952. Ordinary civilians were drafted to clear logs and build the fences, and they'd have lunch breaks, and they wouldn't cross the border. They would actually build the fences that were imprisoning them. And some people would refuse to participate in border construction like this, sometimes with and sometimes without repercussions. You could just say, no, I'm not going to do that. And East Germany didn't have the governmental wherewithal to enforce laws. And then here you see in 1959, these are now soldiers, but there are no fortifications there. It would be easy to cross the border. So my question became, how did people accept this? Why are they building a wall that's imprisoning themselves? And why are they accepting this strange dividing line that suddenly appeared in their midst? And so, although the actual shape of the border was in extreme flux, people saw it as a fait accompli. The border was already there. And so the brutal barrier, I argue, emerged not just from coercion, but the mundane attitudes of people that helped construct it. From ordinary people on both sides. So people adjusted and made do. There's this idea of preemptive or anticipatory obedience, where you obey something that doesn't necessarily exist, making possible a barrier most did not want. Okay, so to explore how this happened, I picked two adjacent cities, Neustadt bei Coburg, which is near Coburg, and it was occupied by the Americans, and Sonneberg, which was occupied by the Soviets. And this is the largest population, about 50,000 people, outside of Berlin. And it was almost like a perfect political science experiment, right? I'm a historian, but here it's like you have two petri dishes, right? And then one side you inject Americans, and the other side you inject Soviets, and you see what happens, right? So at the end of World War I in 1945, these two cities, which, the map doesn't reflect it, but they really have grown together, and they're separated by a checkpoint called Gebrannte Brücke, which conveniently I translate as burned bridge, which, made a very beautiful title for the book. And they're connected by this checkpoint. So, okay, let's go to Burned Bridge. Here's a quick overview of the border's development. I've periodized it into three main phases. Here's Burned Bridge in the late 1940s. It's a busy checkpoint, and the demarcation line was poorly guarded, and it was basically a chaotic crime zone. And it was the American military, in fact, that built the first barriers in this region in 1946. It was the US who built the first fences, and I'll get into why that was. To help contain the situation. So 1952, the border's out of control, and Stalin orders the construction of a barrier, not so much to keep people in. East Germany actually was wanting to get rid of people at this time, but he was trying to stabilize the borderland because residents could still cross very easily. And, I've called this phase the living wall because there's still a border that people can cross. Okay, so here we are in 1961. You can see the Fisher House, which had 7 children that was smuggling everything in the basement on both sides. It's been razed, and by this point, this is when the Berlin Wall goes up, and it's dividing a society already seen to be divided. Here's 1989. You can see it's even more guarded with dog runs, signal fences, and tripwires. And then here's 1989, when Burned Bridge finally opens again. And this is days after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this is today, right? You clear a bunch of borderland, right, to build minefields, and then you have this open meadow, and so it's this booming commercial center with Ronald on one side, and which they fought over, which side was going to get the Ronald, and then a mass mall on the eastern side. Okay, so let's go to the 1940s. Okay, so since this is about the aggregate effects of small decisions and small adjustments, it's really difficult to convey in a talk like this these everyday actions. I mean, I've accumulated thousands of everyday actions. The book really makes an argument by volume. But I want to give you an example of the kinds of things I'm looking at. So let's go to the time of the US and American occupation. This is the late 1940s, and there's endemic theft, abduction by Soviet soldiers, rape by Soviet soldiers. They could cross into the Western Zone for a kilometer with impunity, and shootings, constant shootings of civilians and between soldiers. And so it was technically illegal to cross, but locals still went back and forth all the time, farming, smuggling Christmas ornaments, which were a booming business in the area. And so it was a lot like the US-Mexico border. It was kind of seen as a crime zone with immigrants, Easterners coming over to the West and smugglers. And so increasingly Western border residents began to resent these Eastern crossers. They were poorer. And the dynamic, as I said, was not unlike the US-Mexico border today. And it was Western, the Western side, American soldiers, Western leaders that really were the impetus for border fortifications. And there's a range of actions. Today I'm just going to focus on judicial proceedings. And again, you see changes in policing and business and newspaper rhetoric. This is just one component. So in the judiciary, 3 years after the demarcation first appeared, we're in December 1948, the Western mayor of Neustadt called for the immediate strengthening of the border police and the creation of an effective system of summary court procedures. And this was followed by a meeting that the mayor called with leading Bavarian officials to define what border law would be. And so the Neustadt Border Court tried more than 1,000 defendants over the next 3 years. The local archive that I visited had slated these records for destruction. They were literally in some sort of moldy, forgotten corner because they lacked historical value. But I think these trials tell us a lot. So I went through these 1,000 border trials. And so immediately after the mayor's initiative, Western law targeted Easterners. 90% of the court's defendants were Eastern border smugglers and undocumented workers, mostly from Sonneberg. So these are economic crimes and they're Easterners. But what's even more interesting to me is how quickly border crime, the definition of border crime, shifted. So the economic situation after 1950 was improving. The two Germanys had been created, and anti-communism was growing. And suddenly it was Westerners, Western leftists, Western communists that were the targets of prosecution for attending political events in the East or transporting communist propaganda. So you can see political Westerners are suddenly getting tried. So when I present my work, I often get the challenge, like, come on, wasn't this border inevitable? There was the US and the Soviet army, there was Stalin, what were people really gonna do? And of course my response is no one would deny the importance of geopolitics, but while the states created the conditions for the border, they did not control its outcome, and that local responses are really vital to understanding how the border actually developed. And this legal precedent was established all over the border. And there were local variations. So what was happening in Neustadt wasn't necessarily what was happening 100 kilometers away. And so these local leaders really had power. And so, especially in this early period, the American and Soviet military governments didn't care about the border. It was Germans who were administering it. They just cared about catching Nazis, getting, the lights back on, getting the water functioning, and the demarcation line was really overlooked. And so because the US military was not doing its job, it was these local leaders that would step in. And this is just one example of many, many, many. But it suggests how the border was really put to different uses at different times. Okay, so a quick example, another example from the late 1940s, and this is more funny than anything else. We're in 1949, in between when the two Germanys are getting created, and there was a soccer game between Neustadt and Sonneberg. And the game supposedly straddled the midfield line was the border, right? Because it's an invisible line. And the idea was that Easterners and Westerners could attend without passes. But the players who were running across the midfield line had to have passes. I don't know if the goalies needed passes, but so this was a major event, and 25,000 people came from all over the region, and it was experienced and remembered as a demonstration of local unity. Here we are, all as one, and this is how it's remembered. When you look at the archival record, however, the story is quite different. The game was not actually on the border, but it was entirely in the Soviet zone. But nobody knew where the border lay, right? So nobody knew it was entirely within the Soviet zone. And it was organized by the Soviet zone, by the Communist Party, and it was not a local initiative. The Communist Party was organizing events all along the border to unsettle the West. The West was holding its first federal elections in the summer of 1945, and the Soviets wanted to disrupt those elections. It seems like a weird way to disrupt them, but they did. So this is my favorite picture of the whole talk. If you remember nothing else from the talk, this is it. This is the wall of the mind. This is the border. And so after the game, the Soviet commander of Sonneberg announced that the border would be open for the day. And thousands of Easterners lined up on this invisible line. I mean, there's a little tiny trench, but that's it. For 2.5 kilometers. It's a 2.5 kilometer crowd, just lined up. And the border is very lightly guarded at this time. No one would shoot. It's Americans, and really, like the Western guards at this time didn't even carry rifles. And so this crowd began to cross and easily overwhelmed American forces, and they streamed into the West for shopping, bartering, and this is a lot like the dynamic of 1989, right, where poor Easterners want to cross and see the West. Here they are, and mass chaos erupts. But again, I mean, this is the wall of the mind, right? So here they are in the West. Thousands of Easterners cross. Reportedly, only 400 Westerners cross. There's already this division where Westerners just aren't interested. In Western, and I interviewed a lot of people about this event, and so Westerners say that it was great to see friends and family, but the Eastern crowds were too much, and they were happy when the Sonnebergers went back home again. It's a lot like '89. Still, oh, I'm sorry, that's my phone. So still the Soviet zone organized 3 more mass crossings between the cities over the next 3 months, numbering about 20,000 people each. And these were not the only openings along the border, but they were by far the largest. They made for good propaganda for the East. Since Western forces were trying to prevent the Easterners from crossing, the Soviet zone could publish newspaper articles about armed Americans confronting peaceful crowds on armed vehicles and such. Western newspaper portrayed things very negatively. The New York Times described the Easterners as mobs of shabby people resembling a swarm of locusts. These are direct quotes. Westerners complained about these, quote, invasions. Stores sold out of stock, and local politicians begged the U.S. military government to strengthen border controls. And Western authorities responded. There were border laws passed in response to these events in Neustadt and Sonneberg that had ramifications for the entire border. Border posts were beefed up, more border guards were stationed. However, today these are remembered as local expressions of solidarity. I mailed a 9-page survey, which a lot of people filled out. I mean, people feel really passionate about this history. And so 112 of the respondents were born before 1945, and 81% remembered these events as local initiatives. Only 9% said they were organized by the Communist Party in the Soviet zone, which was the truth. And many locals looked at me skeptically when I talked about the American files I was looking at. And in a television interview I had about this soccer game, one local man just rejected it out of hand and was basically like, no, I don't believe it. So beyond memory, what to me is most significant about these 4 mass crossings is that they were one-sided, right? It was east to west, and extremely short-lived. So just 4 years after the border was imposed, you have thousands of Easterners rushing to Neustadt, and only, Westerners not really caring. And it shows how established the border was. These were events to cross it. And it shows how the border was already a fact of daily life. And so, yes, it's astonishing these people could cross, but it's more astonishing that the next day the border was quiet, right? Easterners knew it was possible to cross the border, but the next day they didn't. Like, that's interesting. So border discipline just very quickly returned to normal, which shows, I think, the role of local compliance. They weren't compliant that day, and look what happened. So would the border have been workable if this, lining up along the demarcation, if this had kept happening? So again, this is part of my argument that it's anticipatory compliance, that this wall in the head caused the border to persist and expand. Okay, so this argument is very easy to make for the post-war period, and most people buy my work on the 40s because, it makes sense, right? I encounter more pushback when I go to the 1980s, so, I'm fine to answer questions about this because I often do. So I'm making this argument for a later period as well. My book goes through each phase of the Cold War, and here I am when the border is already established, when their fortifications are at their absolute height. This is the same site as the soccer games. And in 30 years, life in the East had radically changed. East Germany had created a militarized zone along the border where people living within 5 kilometers, basically everyone here, began to live in a prohibited zone. And in total, the prohibited zone encompassed about 2% of East Germany's population, almost 400,000 people, almost 500,000 people. You could only enter the prohibited zone with a special permit, and you faced constant threat of deportation for unreliable behavior. About 1,000 Sonnebergers were deported over the years. Okay, so within this zone, there was an even stricter 500-meter protection strip. If you lived here, since childhood, you would train in border guarding and border orienteering, and you were expected to become part of border enforcement. Locals became border helpers, and you lived under a range of tight curfews, 9 p.m., no bars, that kind of thing, and a range of daily prohibitions. I don't have time, I think, to show this, but this is a video of what the border looked like in action. So yes, there was this elaborate system of landmines and dog runs and signal fences and tripwires and other booby traps, and people died along this border. And so it's hardly surprising then that the West seized upon East Germany's border regime as inhumane. Does anyone know how many people died along the Iron Curtain? And it's 136. So for all of, the representations, it's very little. About 4,000 people die every year along the U.S.-Mexico border of dehydration and shooting and injuries. So this, yeah. The reality is different from how it was often portrayed. The West seized upon this idea as the border is inhumane, but it's important to see how the West was exaggerating the strength of the Iron Curtain. There was rhetoric of it as a concentration camp wall, and this became a moral fodder for the Cold War. And so newspapers were full of headlines about people trying to escape tyranny, getting blown up, dying in the fortifications, yet they were not always right. This headline is wrong on several accounts. It says, a boy is, crossing from east to west and dying, and Eastern Guards are letting him die. He was actually escaping from west to east. And there are a lot of people, a lot of young people who were in trouble in the West and escaped from west to east. He was in an abusive children's home and was wanting to live with his grandmother. And he didn't die and wound up praising his treatment in Sonneberg's hospital. But the follow-up to the story was, of course, never printed. The government also exaggerated the fortifications. This is a diagram of it, an official government representation, and it's false. Nowhere were there that many, all of these barriers existed, but they were different places along the wall. Nowhere were they everywhere. And then, of course, there are media representations that, again, overstate. And this exaggeration continues today. That reconstruction was made in 2009. West Germany turned the border into a Cold War tourist attraction. The government subsidized trips to the borderland, where border guards led tours. You could take bus rides, visit museums, you could buy postcards, and you could contemplate the Iron Curtain over beers at the Border Cafe in the West. And so these things all reinforce the idea of, you know, a totalitarian structure that was an inevitable reality. Meanwhile, these are Eastern images of the border. It was shown on very rare occasions, but here it doesn't appear as a prison wall, but you have action shots of handsome soldiers, Aryan soldiers, right? There's a lot of continuity here militarily, defending against fascism in the West. And many East Germans believe this. Another video I don't have time for. But there was an interest on both sides in portraying the border as formidable. And this menacing border did indeed work. So after 1961, the number officially of escapes dropped from several thousand a year to under 100 a year by the 1970s. So imagine, from Chicago to New Orleans, fewer than 100 people crossing a year, right? That's astounding. And so the border does appear impenetrable from these statistics, and these are both, these are Western because they're more comprehensive, but Western and Eastern statistics really do line up. It's not, yeah. And they add up locally too, right? I've tabulated it both federally and added it up locally, and I'm happy with these numbers. So if you look beyond the official reports, however, you get a different picture. So here we are in 1982. Officially, only 72 people crossed the border, 5 of them in Sonneberg. But random sources suggest much more activity. This is one letter from 1982. A woman gave this to me, and she mentions to her relatives in Neustadt that her son came over the border again to visit us. This is 1982. He just came over the border to the West to visit us. And although this kind of evidence is anecdotal, there are such fragments in people's attics and conversations, and I've had a lot of conversations with locals where they say, oh yeah, we were getting drunk and we crossed the border, and it was something that was kind of known. And so I think it's really interesting also what border agencies knew about these local crossings. Here's a document from East Germany State Security, or Stasi, which is, you know, a notorious organization of state policing and seen to be, you know, one of the most formidable apparatuses in history. So it describes the antics of 3 young men from Sonneberg who, within 6 months in 1982, crossed the border 45 times to visit their families and to sell border mines to Western soldiers for cash. So this one document shows 45 crossings by 3 guys in 6 months. And the irony is that the East German border forces did not even realize the boys were crossing or stealing border mines until they were arrested in West Germany. And why were they arrested in West Germany? Because it was illegal to vandalize the wall. So that's really interesting. So they were arrested in West Germany, and that's how the Stasi found out about it. So these cases raise the obvious question, how much crossing was really happening over the border? And they also raise a question about reporting. None of these incidences were reported publicly. And government agencies on both sides knew about these boys. I've gone through local police reports, and there are a bunch of them. They're just returned the next day. So these didn't make it into any official numbers of other crossings that I've ever seen. And so why is this? East Germany certainly had no interest in admitting the border was vulnerable, right? And West Germany had a policy of not publicizing these crossings because it did not want to get the Eastern families in trouble. Right? And so they and they also didn't want to mislead Easterners to say it was easy to cross the border. So Western motives were to protect Easterners, but ironically, by saying no one was crossing the border, they were making the border seem stronger than it was, because they didn't want to encourage more crossing and putting Easterners in danger. But, you know, I wonder if these numbers had been publicized in some fashion, would it have changed people's perception of the border and in turn changed people's reality? Okay, so then the question is, how was it possible? How is this possible for people to actually cross this formidable barrier? And the short answer is local knowledge. Here is a scrapbook from an Eastern border soldier. And border residents were part of East Germany's border apparatus. This was a living, breathing system that was peopled by people. And so here you see this border soldier's photos of his buddies. He's chatting with this local woman, Frida, at his favorite bar. And the troops were really part of everyday life, frequently marrying local girls and then staying in the borderland. And this was encouraged. And because border residents were part of the system, they knew how it worked. So if you lived in this protection strip, about half the population were soldiers and half were ordinary people, but they were really enmeshed. And the strength of the Iron Curtain really depended upon these people. Up to a quarter of people who were arrested trying to cross were turned in by civilians. Up to a quarter of people were turned in by civilians who were voluntary border helpers and ordinary residents. So in the story I just told, one of the young men, one who'd crossed 23 times in 6 months, his mother was a cook for the border troops, and his dad was an unofficial informant for the Stasi. So his parents were part of the border apparatus, and he was meanwhile crossing. He knew the patrol routes, he knew where the fortifications were the weakest, he knew where the mines were rotten. So here's the irony, that the very same people who were defending the border system and making it possible were also in a position to subvert it. And they did subvert it. And so this is the paradox. And many of them would denounce you or me if we walked into this border zone. You were supposed to denounce outsiders. And they would have, but meanwhile they're crossing. So the paradox, we have this strong border that was oddly porous for these people who had inside knowledge. Here's a sketch by one man who befriended a border soldier at a bar and devised this elaborate plan, crossing the border 3 times in the mid-'80s, just kind of for fun. And these kinds of documents, as I said, are anecdotal, but they're in people's homes. I can't give you any precise number of them. I think it would be impossible, but I think their sheer existence shifts our understanding of the border. And again, these are a lot of teenage and boys and men in their 20s, drunk, pretty much. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it was a local sport. So the physical fortifications were far more fallible than people tended to think. Here's just a funny anecdote from 1963. We're turning back in time. This is a toddler who crossed 4 fences in a minefield. He's 2.5 years old. He just simply wandered off during a festival in the East. And, you know, I interviewed his mother, and she said she just sort of turned her back, and there he was gone. And the whole town went out to search and had no idea, and it never occurred to them he could cross the border. Just that's how much it was in everybody's head. But he was too light to activate the mines, so that's how he crossed. And he was found napping on the western side of the border and found by an elderly couple. And he lost a shoe. And again, you sort of see this Western dynamic with new shoes. He's going back in the zone, right? West Germany was not recognizing East Germany as a state, so they called it the zone, the Soviet zone. And the beneficent Westerners were giving him shoes. So even in the 70s and 80s, to wrap up, the border was plagued by malfunctions, defunct tripwires and signal fences. East Germany was running out of money. It was putting decoy cardboard soldiers in watchtowers. It was reducing border forces. It had a lot of other priorities. And And again, these young people would be crossing. Sometimes they would be trying to escape during fighting with parents, the angst of young love, poor grades in school, boredom of life, you know, petty theft, that kind of thing, for which they were scared to be arrested. So in the 1960s, officials estimated that 90% were, of these local crossers were male, 3/4 were under the age of 25, 1/3 were in trouble with the state, and half were drunk. So there was this kind of border youth subculture in the 1960s. But again, these did not make it into official statistic. But did this potential subversion suggest that the strength of the Iron Curtain depended less on physical defenses than upon the accommodations of border residents? And this relates to the ultimate fall of the Berlin Wall. And this is where I get into trouble sometimes, but this is where the wall opened on Bahnhofstrasse. And, you know, the story, Günther Schabowski bumbled an announcement, a visa announcement, suggesting you could cross into the West visa-free, which he shouldn't have said, and wasn't the visa law that was passed. But East Germans flooded to the checkpoint, and this is the first one that opened. And it opened because of a crowd. There was so much pressure from the crowd that Western border guards didn't know what to do and just started letting Easterners cross because they were chanting and yelling. It's worth looking up the video on YouTube. You know, it's about a 20-minute process, but people literally shoved through the border. And if you think about that slide that I love with people lining up on that invisible line, this is how it happened. And again, I don't want to deny how dangerous the border is. That's where I get in trouble, but there is a role for this anticipatory compliance. And sure, Gorbachev, Perestroika, again, I'm acknowledging geopolitics, but this is when the threshold of fear tipped and the Iron Curtain collapsed. And I also think it's significant that East Germany, you know, was experiencing all these peace prayers and demonstrations in Leipzig of 70,000 people and an incredible movement, but it was the fall of the wall that was the death knell of East Germany, because that had been the symbol of what was holding it up. It was when the Berlin Wall fell, it was nothing to do with politics or mass movements as much as this. So to wrap up, I hope you see that the Iron Curtain was no neat, tidy story of a monolithic barrier, the familiar narrative of the Berlin Wall, but you see how this jumble of local and personal and global interests formed the border. And so although the majority of border residents did not want it, this was unpopular, without realizing it through these actions, large and small, their daily accommodations helped grow and sustain it. So I just want to argue for the place of everyday history in geopolitics. That's basically my message. And, you know, again, I'm not arguing against the power of states and policies, but it's geopolitics is lived by ordinary people and buttressed by ordinary people. And I think Burn Bridge really spotlights this intersection of public events and private choices, and the geopolitical significance of small accumulated local action. And again, just to repeat myself, you have the creation of difference where there is no difference, right? The Thousand-Year Reich. You have the institutionalization of violence among neighbors, people who are considered the same, popular participation in a system that was deeply unpopular, and people normalizing a monstrosity in their midst. I also just want to say that Germany, West Germany's been held up as this model of democracy, and East Germany a model communist state, but I think Germany's post-war history looks far less peaceable, right? Germany is seen as a success story in both East and West for their respective blocs, but if you look at this border, it's not a normal country, and it's a lot less peaceable with these people supporting it, this deadly barrier, than I think we tend to see. So, yeah, micro steps can have unexpected results. So, thank you.